Throughout history, the Igbo people have been a symbol of resilience, innovation, and deep-rooted cultural power. Yet one of the most profound questions that echoes through the corridors of time is why a people so endowed with wisdom, unity, and spirit, and strength of character often appear not to have fought for their freedom and rights with the fury the world might have expected. To answer this is to peel back the layers of history that were written not only by the victors but by those who profited from the silence of others. The Igbos, scattered across the rich eastern lands of Nigeria and far beyond its shores, have faced colonization, forced migration, slavery, civil war, economic marginalization, and systemic erasure. Yet they remain among the most industrious, self-reliant, and adaptive people on earth. To say they did not fight would be to misunderstand the nature of their struggle. The fight of the Igbo has never been solely about the sword. It has been about survival through intellect, persistence, and strategic adaptation in a world often bent on their subjugation. They did not always march with armies, but they resisted with trade. They fought with education. They reclaimed with enterprise, and they rebuilt with an indomitable will that few could comprehend. The world often imagines freedom as something won by open war, by revolution, by dramatic uprisings that paint the sky with smoke and the ground with fire. But for many indigenous nations, and particularly for the Igbo, the battlefield was not always physical. It was social, cultural, and economic. Under the weight of colonial laws, they built secret societies that kept their traditions alive. Under slavery, they kept their names hidden in songs, their languages whispered in lullabies, their gods remembered in secret gatherings across foreign lands. They fought not always to destroy their oppressors, but to ensure that their children would still remember who they were when the guns fell silent. The question of why they did not openly fight more often is a question that ignores the wars they waged every day. Wars to educate their sons and daughters when systems denied them schooling, wars to own land when policies tried to dispossess them, wars to trade when blockades closed their ports, wars to be heard when media tried to silence their voices, wars to rebuild when their towns were left in ashes after civil conflict. The Igbo people fought, but their fight was often a quiet one, a war of persistence rather than destruction. Their society has always valued dialogue, council, and consensus. Before the coming of foreign rule, the Igbo practiced a form of democracy rooted in assemblies of elders, titled men and women, and collective decision-making. They were not ruled by kings in the same manner as other tribes. They were ruled by the voice of the people. When colonialism came with its guns and flags, it was difficult for such a decentralized system to mount a single unified military resistance. Instead, each community calculated how best to survive, how best to preserve what could be saved, and how to adapt until a day came when their children could rise with greater strength. That choice, while often misread as passivity, was a form of long-term resistance. They chose the future over the moment, survival over suicide, continuity over spectacle. Moreover, the Igbo knew the cost of open rebellion. History shows that when they did rise, when they declared their right to exist as the Republic of Biafra, they faced one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century, with starvation used as a weapon, blockades that choked their land, and a silence from the world that left them isolated. They fought with courage, but the world did not come to their aid, and millions of innocents paid the price. After such devastation, many Igbo elders vowed that the next battles would not be fought with guns but with books, with commerce, with migration, with education, with unity in trade and influence. Their enemies underestimated them, thinking that defeat in war meant the end of their ambition. But the Igbo spirit is like the kola nut. It may be broken, but its essence remains strong and its taste lingers far beyond the moment of the crack. To ask why the Igbo people did not fight for their freedom is to overlook how they fought differently. They chose to infiltrate rather than explode, to outgrow rather than overthrow, to compete in markets where their presence was unwelcome, to dominate in fields of science, business, and education where systems had been designed to keep them out. They turned cities that were foreign to them into places where their names now adorn streets and their shops power economy. They fought with vision, believing that true freedom is not merely the absence of chains but the presence of dignity, wealth, knowledge, and the ability to define one's future without asking for permission. Even in the diaspora, their battle continued. On distant shores where their ancestors were carried in chains, their descendants rose to prominence in arts, politics, and enterprise. The Igbo name became synonymous with ingenuity, with a refusal to be second class, with a deep hunger for rest. Their freedom struggle was not a moment in history, it was a continuum. It moved from the slave ships to the plantations, from the plantations to the post-colonial cities, from the refugee camps of war to the boardrooms of today. Their weapon was memory, their shield was adaptability, and their strategy was to survive until survival turned into dominance. It is time the world understands that freedom is not always won by the loudest voice or the fiercest army. Sometimes it is won by the people who outlast their oppressors, who build while others destroy, who teach their children the truth while the world teaches lies. The Igbo people embody that lesson. Their rights have been trampled, their lands exploited, their names erased in some books, but they have written new books. They have built new lands, they have carried their rights in their hearts and expressed them in their achievement. They may not have fought every battle with bullets, but they fought every battle with purpose. Today the question is not why they did not fight. The question is how they survived every attempt to erase them. And the answer lies in their culture of resilience, their insistence on education, their entrepreneurial spirit, their ability to turn strangers into brothers and foreign lands into familiar homes. Their story teaches us that freedom is not a single event, it is a way of living that must be reclaimed every day, even in silence, even in exile, even in the shadow of defeat. The world may have expected them to rise with fire each time, but the Igbo chose to rise with wisdom. They built their freedom not in a single declaration but in generations of persistence. Their fight continues not on battlefields but in classrooms, in markets, in parliaments, in families who teach their children to never forget who they are. The real question we must ask is if a people can survive everything that was meant to destroy them without losing their spirit, without abandoning their dreams, without forgetting their roots, have they not already won the greatest kind of freedom? It is a freedom the world cannot grant, because it was never in the world's power to give, it was always theirs to claim, and they claimed it in the only way they knew, by being unbreakable. The Igbo did not lose the war. They changed the battlefield, and in that single line lies a history that has been misunderstood, misrepresented, and too often silenced by those who wish to write their story with only the ink of conquest. For centuries they have been painted either as a people who surrendered too easily or as a people too fractured to stand united, but that is a distortion born from looking only at the surface of wars and ignoring the deeper, more enduring strategies of survival. The Igbo understood something that many great empires never grasped, that not every war is won with a sword, not every freedom is secured with a bullet, and not every victory is carved into monuments of stone. They saw that the world was changing, that the oppressor's strength was not always in his army, but in his laws, his schools, his commerce, and his ability to rewrite identity. So they changed the battlefield to match the times. When the guns roared and the flags of empire were planted in their soil, they calculated what could be preserved, what could be hidden in plain sight, what could be passed down in whispers when shouting would bring destruction. They fought for the survival of their culture, their language, their market systems, their belief in collective decision-making, and their deep-seated philosophy that the strength of a people lies not in one throne but in the many voices that gather under the moonlight to decide their future. To change the battlefield is not to give up, it is to adapt, and the Igbo are masters of adaptation. Long before colonization, they had built a society that prized initiative, trade, and education. When colonial rulers imposed foreign governance, the Igbo sent their children to learn in the very schools meant to erase them, but instead of being erased, they came back sharper, able to navigate the new systems and turn them to their advantage. When laws denied them land rights, they expanded their networks of commerce beyond borders. When war came to their door during the Biafran conflict, they fought with courage, but when defeat threatened to erase them entirely, they rebuilt with an energy that stunned even their former enemy. In markets from Onitsha to Aba, in businesses that sprung up from the ashes of war, in the migration patterns that carried them to Lagos, Accra, London, New York, and beyond, the Igbo showed that a battlefield can be a boardroom, a classroom, a shipping lane, a trade route, or a story told at night that keeps a name alive. The world often mistakes silence for submission, but the Igbo's silence after the guns fell was not surrender, it was strategy. They rebuilt quietly while the world looked elsewhere. They invested in education while others fought for title. They sent their sons and daughters abroad to study, to trade, to create wealth that would one day return to rebuild their homeland. They fought for their freedom not by begging for it, but by creating conditions where their influence could no longer be ignored. Every store opened in a city that once rejected them, every scholarship earned by a child whose grandparents had been denied schooling, every marketplace dominated by Igbo traders in lands far from the Niger Delta was a victory. These victories were not loud, but they were lasting, and they changed the balance of power in ways no open battle could have achieved in their time. Changing the battlefield also meant preserving their identity in ways that colonizers could not anticipate. They used proverbs, folk tales, masquerades, festivals, and names as weapons of memory. Even when their artifacts were stolen and their stories rewritten, they made new art, told new stories, and taught their children the old ways with new language. They knew that if a people remembers who they are, no amount of conquest can make them truly disappear. This is why, decades after attempts to erase them, the Igbo language is still spoken, their traditions still observed, their entrepreneurial reputation still intact, and their diaspora still connected to the heartbeat of home. The idea that the Igbo lost is therefore incomplete. They may have lost battles, but they refused to lose their future. They changed the definition of warfare itself, turning survival into a slow, quiet, relentless victory. When others celebrated momentary triumphs on the battlefield, the Igbo planted seeds that would grow for generations. Their resistance was not always visible, but it was effective. They turned scars into maps, exile into opportunity, defeat into a lesson that would shape their children into doctors, engineers, traders, authors, and leaders. To understand this is to understand that true power does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it trades, sometimes it migrates, sometimes it waits. The Igbo did not lose because their story did not end with war. It continued in the rebuilding of cities, in the spread of their people across continents, in the influence they wield today in economies and cultures far beyond their homeland. They changed the battlefield so that their survival would not depend on the mercy of others, but on their own ability to create, adapt, and thrive no matter where history placed them. In a world that still measures strength by the noise of conflict, the Igbo remind us that the quiet strategies often leave the deepest marks. Their choice to fight in different arenas was not weakness. It was wisdom born of pain and force. They saw that the oppressor's greatest weapon was not always his army, but his ability to erase history, and so they fought to keep that history alive, even if it meant burying it in the hearts of their people until the time came to speak it aloud again. Today, the echoes of that strategy can be seen everywhere, from the vibrant markets they control, to the literature that carries their voice across the globe, to the scientific, artistic, and entrepreneurial achievements of their sons and daughters. They changed the battlefield, and in doing so they taught the world a lesson that freedom is not always a single moment of uprising. Sometimes it is a lifetime of persistence, a legacy of memory, a network of influence built quietly until it cannot be undone. Their war was never just about winning land, it was about keeping their soul intact. They fought without guns, their weapon was endurance. And in that quiet, uncelebrated choice lies one of the most profound forms of resistance ever recorded in the story of a people. To outsiders who look for smoke, fire, and the sound of drums before they recognize a struggle, it may have seemed as though the Igbo people yielded, as though they accepted the weight of oppression without protest. But that is a misunderstanding born of only seeing war in its loudest form. The Igbo learned early that the most enduring battles are not always fought in the open fields, but in the hearts, in the markets, in the minds of the young, and in the corridors of decisions that determine the future long after the gunpowder has faded. Endurance was not their weakness, it was their weapon, sharpened by centuries of knowing that survival itself can be the most powerful form of defiance. When slave ships raided their lands, they endured by preserving fragments of language, song, and memory that would later give descendants in foreign lands a trail back to who they were. When colonial masters redrew their lands and forced new systems upon them, they endured by bending without breaking, learning those systems not as servants but as future players who would use the very tools of the oppressor to rise again. This endurance was not passive, it was strategic. It meant waking before dawn to open markets when laws restricted their trade, sending children to learn in schools where their heritage was mocked, so that one day those children would rewrite the same laws, and gathering under moonlit trees to tell stories that the textbooks refused to teach. It meant rebuilding towns after they were bombed, replanting fields after they were burned, restoring families after they were scattered. It meant choosing to live through the humiliation of being underestimated so that they could one day surpass those who underestimated them. Endurance for the Igbo was a shield, a seed, and a map. They held it close while the storms raged, knowing that time would one day turn in their favor. When the world demanded open rebellion as proof of courage, the Igbo offered something subtler but no less brave: persistence. They moved into cities where they were unwelcome and made themselves indispensable. They created networks of trade that could not be ignored. They educated a generation that would grow into engineers, doctors, inventors, writers, and leaders. Every school they built, every apprenticeship they funded, every market they opened was a statement: you may control the land today, but you will not control tomorrow. And that is the genius of endurance. It looks like silence to those who do not understand it, but to those who practice it, it is the slow building of a wall that one day will be too high to climb. Their endurance was tested beyond measure during the Biafran War, when hunger was weaponized, when blockades turned fertile lands into wastelands, when the world turned its eyes away from their suffering. Yet from that famine they rose, and with empty hands they built again. They turned scars into landmarks, loss into lessons, and tragedy into the foundation of new ambition. They endured not because they had no choice, but because they understood that some victories are measured not in the battles you win, but in the generations you raise after the battles are lost. This is the kind of fight that does not make headlines, but reshapes destinies. It is the kind of resistance that colonizers feared most, not the uprising they could crush with guns, but the quiet resilience that outlasted their empire. Endurance allowed the Igbo to carry their culture across oceans, to teach their children pride in exile, to transform exile into opportunity, and to create wealth in places designed to deny them a future. Even in the diaspora, this weapon of endurance traveled with them. It whispered to them when they faced prejudice, reminded them who they were when they were called by other names, and pushed them to succeed in industries and nations that had no room for them until they forced doors open with the sheer weight of their persistence. It is easy to romanticize sudden revolutions, but the Igbo way teaches that the most unshakable freedom is often the one earned slowly. Endurance is not glamorous. It does not win parades. It does not always offer the satisfaction of immediate triumph, but it builds something stronger than a quick victory. It builds it allows a people to survive invasions, betrayals by their own countrymen, foreign manipulation, and still rise without losing their soul. That is why today, when the world studies African commerce, education, innovation, and diaspora strength, the Igbo name cannot be left out. Their weapon was not a cannon or a spear, it was the ability to keep going when others stopped, to plant seeds when others abandoned the field, to hope when hope seemed foolish. Endurance is not the absence of pain, it is the decision to carry that pain until it becomes a stepping stone. The Igbo carried centuries of displacement, wars, and policies designed to erase them, and yet they refused to disappear. They endured when their artifacts were stolen, when their stories were buried, when their towns were denied infrastructure, when their votes were manipulated, when their children were mocked for their accent in cities far from home. And because they endured, they have become a lesson to the world that freedom can be fought for with patience as much as with protest, that rights can be reclaimed through education as well as through revolution, that survival is itself a declaration of independence. Their fight without guns is not a lesser fight, it is a different kind of war, one fought in the shadows of history and one in the light of the future. It is the reason why, despite everything, the Igbo continue to influence politics, shape economies, create art, and tell stories that travel further than the chains that once tried to hold them. They turned their endurance into a legacy, and that legacy is their weapon. Chains could bind their bodies, but never their spirit, and in that truth lies the undying heartbeat of the Igbo people, whose history carries the scars of captivity, yet shines with the radiance of survival. For centuries, forces from within and beyond their lands sought to confine them, to capture their hands for labor, to lock their feet in shackles, to turn their backs into tools for foreign gain. Yet no chain forged by man could hold what lived inside them. The fire of memory, the will to create, the refusal to forget. When slave traders stormed their villages and tore families apart, when the clinking of iron replaced the rhythm of drums, when the ocean swallowed their cries on ships bound for strange lands, their bodies suffered the weight, but their souls learned to hide their names in song, to carve their stories into the air with each breath, to pass on their gods and ancestors in whispers even when their tongues were beaten. A chain can hold the hands, but it cannot hold the dream of a child. A lock can close a door, but it cannot silence the prayer of a mother. A shackle can drag a man, but it cannot stop him from remembering where he came from. That is how the Igbo survived when empires counted them as numbers, when plantations called them property, when the world tried to erase their humanity. They carried their freedom inside until the day came to breathe it again. Even under colonial domination, when laws restricted their movement, when land was seized, when their councils were replaced by foreign administrators who neither spoke their tongue nor cared for their customs, they did not let the iron enter their soul. They traded when trade was forbidden. They gathered when gatherings were banned. They educated their sons and daughters when schools taught them to despise their own names. Their spirit became the place where no foreign soldier could mock. It was the library that no invader could burn because it was written in memory. It was the shrine no missionary could desecrate because it was built in the heart. It was the marketplace no law could close because it existed in the way they shared, bargained, built and rebuilt even in exile. Their chains were visible, their resistance was not always seen, but it was there, quiet, deliberate, relentless. When the Biafran War came, and with it the blockade that starved millions, the Igbo were once again trapped, their lands cut off, their hands empty, their children hungry. Yet even then their spirit would not surrender. Out of scarcity they invented, out of destruction they improvised, out of grief they planned for the generations to come. And when the war ended not in their favor, they did not dissolve into the dust of defeat. They rose from it carrying the ashes as a reminder, not a tombstone. Chains could crush a body, but they could not crush an idea. The idea that a people can decide to live, can decide to thrive, even when history denies them the right to do so. Across the Atlantic, their descendants bore surnames they did not choose, labored in lands they did not own, but the pulse of their ancestors spoke in their resilience. They became farmers, builders, preachers, writers, merchants, and leaders in lands that called them slaves, then strangers, then citizens who would never fully belong. Yet they carved belonging from the very earth that once held them captive. They sang in dialects born of pain but remembered fragments of Igbo words. They drummed rhythms that matched the heartbeat of villages they had never seen but always carried. That is the power of a spirit that cannot be bound. It finds ways to speak even when the tongue is silenced. It finds ways to walk even when the feet are chained. It finds ways to create even when the hands are calloused from forced labor. The world has always underestimated the power of an unbroken spirit. Armies can conquer cities, governments can pass laws, traders can sell bodies, but none of them can own a people's memory if that people refuses to forget. The Igbo made their endurance a weapon. They made their survival a revolution that stretched beyond the lifespan of empires. They turned oppression into a forge that hardened them, not into statues, but into living architects of their destiny. Their markets flourished after blockades. Their sons and daughters became scholars after schools rejected them. Their diaspora became a network of strength rather than a sign of weakness. In every insult they planted a seed. In every exile they found a new map. In every attempt to break them they discovered a reason to rise higher. Chains could be made of iron, of law, of prejudice, of economic exclusion, of deliberate erasure in history books, but none of those chains lasted when faced with a spirit that refuses to die. That is why today the Igbo culture is not a relic, it is a force. It lives in festivals where ancestors are remembered, in cities where Igbo traders build new empires, in universities where Igbo scholars rewrite the pages that were torn from their past. It lives in the names still given to children that carry the echo of the river Niger, in the proverbs that still guide decisions at dawn, in the language that still shapes thought even in places where it was once forbidden. Their story is a warning to the world. You may control a body for a season, but you cannot own a soul that has chosen to remain free. You may erase a name from a census, but you cannot erase the pride that whispers that name to a child at bedtime. You may scatter a people, but you cannot stop them from finding one another. Across seas, across borders, across centuries, chains bind flesh, but freedom lives where memory, courage, and will choose to gather. The Igbo are living proof. Freedom is not always won by fire. Sometimes it is built brick by brick, stone by stone, day after day, with the hands that once carried burdens becoming the very tools that build a future no oppressor can destroy. For the Igbo people, history did not always give them the luxury of grand battles where a single victory could change everything. Often they were met with overwhelming force, foreign laws and systems designed to break their will and erase their heritage. Yet they understood that freedom is not only a moment of revolt, but a journey of patience, courage, and endurance. It is in the silent work of rebuilding after war, in the quiet decision to educate the next generation, in the relentless drive to trade when markets are closed to them, and in the ability to transform wounds into wisdom. When others expected them to rise in flames, they chose to rise in growth, because flames can burn bright and then fade, but growth leaves roots that cannot easily be torn out. After the chains of slavery and the devastation of the Middle Passage, many of their people found themselves scattered across foreign lands where their language was forbidden, their songs ridiculed, their names stripped away, yet they did not answer every insult with a blade. They answered it by planting seeds in hostile soil, by teaching their children that their worth was not measured by the master's chains, by building communities within places that called them outsiders. Freedom in those times was not a fortress taken by storm, it was a garden watered with tears, patience, and sacrifice. Each act of survival became a brick. Each trade across dangerous seas became a brick. Each whispered story of ancestors under a foreign night sky became a brick. Brick by brick, they laid the foundation for a dignity that could not be bought or sold. Even in their homeland, when colonial powers drew borders that ignored their traditions, when foreign administrators dismantled their councils and tried to impose systems that had no respect for their wisdom, the Igbo learned that sometimes the fight is not in open fields, but in the marketplace, in the classroom, in the family compound. They built networks of trade so strong that they could not be ignored. They valued education so deeply that each new scholar was a fortress, each new reader a soldier of the mind. Where others saw defeat, they saw instruction. Where others preached surrender, they practiced adaptation. They did not abandon the dream of freedom, they redefined the path toward it. For them, freedom was not always about a sword drawn in the night, it was about a community that rises in the morning and still dares to plan for tomorrow. During the Biafran War and its aftermath, the world saw images of starvation and ruin, and many assumed that the Igbo would be crushed forever under the weight of their loss. But what followed was not a people who vanished, it was a people who rebuilt with a ferocity that only patience can bring. They turned small businesses into major enterprises. They rebuilt towns that had been reduced to ashes. They sent their children to schools even when coins were scarce, and they taught them to carry both the memory of suffering and the vision of something great. Each road repaired, each market reopened, each handshake in commerce was another brick in a freedom that did not rely on the permission of governments or the mercy of foreign powers. To fight with fire is to burn quickly, but to build brick by brick is to create something that will outlast the fire. The Igbo chose to invest in their future, sometimes in silence, sometimes in exile, often in the face of ridicule and discrimination, but always with a vision that stretched beyond their life. Their freedom was not gifted to them, it was assembled piece by piece until the structure became too strong to dismantle. In faraway lands, in cities that once sold their ancestors, their descendants rose as scholars, doctors, merchants, leaders, carrying that same lesson. Not every chain is broken in a single strike. some are dissolved by generations of determined hands. This lesson matters because the world often celebrates only the loud victories, the battles won, the empires toppled, the flags raised, but rarely honors the patient work of a people who decide not to vanish. The Igbo have shown that freedom is not only the absence of chains but the presence of self-built opportunity, cultural memory, and communal strength. When the world closes a door, they build a new one. When history erases their name, they teach it again in their home. When power silences their voice, they sing louder in their markets, their meetings, their migration routes. Brick by brick, they have built a story that cannot be burned, for it is written not only in books but in the will of millions. Their journey is proof that patience is not weakness, that survival is not surrender, and that the slow building of a free life can be more enduring than the brief blaze of a violent revolt. The Igbo continue to add bricks, each invention, each trade link, each child who learns the old tongue, each festival that calls the ancestors by name, each reunion across the diaspora, each memory preserved when others forget. These are the bricks of a people who know that true freedom is lived, not begged for, and that the tallest walls of oppression eventually crumble when a determined hand builds something taller beside them.